When a waitress serves J.D. Vance and finds a heartfelt note on the check, her emotional response sparks a powerful moment of kindness and unexpected connection. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of pastries, filling the small cafe with a comforting warmth. Outside, the world rushed by, but inside, the hum of conversation had dwindled to a soft murmur. It was mid-afternoon, the lull between the morning rush and evening bustle. Yet for Andrea, the day felt never-ending. She glanced at the clock above the counter. Another hour to go. Her feet ached from hours of standing, her back protested each time she bent to clear a table, and her tips today had been discouragingly low. Most customers barely glanced at her as they dropped a few coins on the table, eyes glued to their phones. Andrea sighed, pulling her unruly hair into a tighter ponytail as she leaned against the counter for a moment. Rent was due in 2 days, and her phone bill lingered unpaid. She had long since stopped counting the number of times she had skipped meals to stretch her paycheck. Her mother's prescriptions added another layer of stress to her precarious balancing act. But Andrea pushed those thoughts aside. Her manager, a weary woman with lines of exhaustion etched into her face, caught Andrea's eye from across the cafe. With a small nod, she seemed to say, "Hang in there." Andrea managed a weak smile in return before grabbing her order pad and heading toward the last occupied table. The cafe's warmth and charm, which usually masked its weariness, seemed to dim as Andrea moved between the tables. She wiped down a sticky surface near the window, her hands moving automatically. Each clink of cutlery felt louder than it should, grating against her nerves. Her body ached, but it was the weight in her chest, the constant pressure of trying to stay afloat, that truly wore her down. The bell above the door jingled suddenly, snapping her out of her thoughts. She turned toward the entrance, her pen hovering over her order pad. A man stepped inside, tall and lean, his simple attire somehow effortlessly polished. Behind him, two other men entered, their eyes scanning the cafe with subtle vigilance. Andrea blinked. Security? The cafe was a modest neighborhood spot, far from the kind of place high-profile figures frequented. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked closer at the man, now making his way toward a corner table. There was something familiar about him, his posture, the way he carried himself with quiet confidence. Andrea's breath caught when it clicked. J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States. For a moment she froze, pen still poised in midair. She had seen his face on the news countless times, the subject of interviews and headlines, but seeing him here, in person, felt surreal. Stay calm, she told herself, shifting into the professionalism her job demanded. She smoothed her apron, forced a polite smile, and approached his table. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. "Can I get you something to start?" J.D. Vance looked up, and for a brief moment, Andrea felt as though she was being truly seen. His expression was calm, his piercing gaze softened by a hint of warmth. "I'll have a cappuccino," he said, his voice measured and kind. "And maybe one of those croissants if they're fresh." Andrea nodded, scribbling the order on her pad. "Absolutely. Anything else?" He shook his head. "That'll be perfect. Thank you." His words, though simple, carried a sincerity that caught Andrea off guard. She turned and headed back to the counter, trying to shake the odd sensation that lingered. He was just a customer, an important one, sure, but a customer nonetheless. As she prepared the cappuccino, her eyes darted back to his table. J.D. sat quietly, his posture straight but relaxed, gazing out the window. Unlike most patrons, he wasn't buried in his phone or tapping away on a laptop. He seemed entirely present, lost in thought. Andrea frothed the milk, the hiss of the machine filling the otherwise quiet cafe. She focused on her movements, keeping them deliberate to steady her nerves. It wasn't every day the Vice President of the United States walked into your workplace. Balancing the tray with practiced ease, Andrea approached his table and placed the cappuccino and croissant in front of him. "Here you go," she said, keeping her tone neutral but polite. J.D. looked up and offered a faint smile. "Thank you." "You're welcome," she replied, stepping back. "Let me know if you need anything else." As she turned to return to the counter, she felt his gaze linger. It wasn't intrusive or uncomfortable, just curious. Andrea's chest tightened, and she chastised herself. Why was she acting this way? He was just another customer. The minutes ticked by. Andrea busied herself cleaning tables and refilling sugar containers, but she couldn't help stealing glances at the corner table. JD remained composed, sipping his cappuccino and breaking off small pieces of the croissant. There was a quiet dignity about him, a kind of grounded presence that set him apart from anyone else she had served. Andrea's exhaustion briefly faded into the background. In its place, a strange energy bubbled up. Nerves, curiosity, maybe even a glimmer of hope. Little did she know, this seemingly ordinary moment was about to transform her day and her life. The bell above the cafe door chimed, its familiar jingle cutting through the soft hum of background music. Andrea turned her head instinctively, her pen hovering over the order pad. The man who stepped inside was tall and lean, his simple attire giving him an air of effortless confidence. A crisp white shirt tucked into dark slacks made him look approachable yet refined. But it wasn't his outfit or his posture that made Andrea pause. It was his face, calm, composed, and immediately recognizable. Andrea's heart skipped a beat as the realization sank in. J.D. Vance, the J.D. Vance, Vice President of the United States. Behind him, two men followed with the practiced nonchalance of trained security. They moved subtly, their eyes scanning the cafe's corners, but their presence was unmistakable. Andrea blinked, unsure if her exhaustion was playing tricks on her. JD glanced around the cafe before settling at a small table near the window, his movements unhurried. He looked out of place in the modest cafe, but not because of any air of superiority. If anything, his simplicity and lack of fanfare made him blend in too well, as though he were trying to slip through unnoticed. Andrea's feet refused to move. Her pen remained suspended midair, her mind racing. She had served hundreds of customers over the years, from demanding business people to overexcited teenagers, but none had ever been the vice president. Andrea! Her manager's hushed whisper startled her. Andrea turned to see her boss standing by the counter, gesturing for her to go over. She took a deep breath, wiped her slightly trembling hands on her apron, and walked toward JD's table. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "Can I get you something to start?" JD looked up, meeting her gaze with an expression that caught her off guard. His eyes weren't cold or calculating like she might have expected from a politician. Instead, they were warm, with a quiet intensity that made her feel as though he was paying attention. Not just to her words, but to her as a person. "I'll have a cappuccino," he said in a soft, measured tone, "and one of those croissants, if they're fresh." Andrea nodded quickly, scribbling the order on her pad. "Absolutely. Anything else?" "That's all," he replied, offering a faint smile. "Thank you." The simplicity of the interaction disarmed her. His tone carried no hint of entitlement, no expectation of special treatment. He sounded like any other customer. Polite, even kind. "Coming right up," Andrea said, retreating toward the counter with a mix of relief and disbelief. Behind her, JD settled into his seat, his posture relaxed but composed. He pulled a glass of water closer and sipped it slowly, his gaze drifting toward the street outside. Andrea busied herself at the espresso machine, her hands moving with practiced precision as the steam hissed and milk frothed. But her thoughts refused to focus. She stole another glance at the corner table, her curiosity growing with every passing second. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or tapping away on a laptop like most patrons. Instead, he sat quietly, his attention seemingly lost in the world beyond the cafe window. The sunlight streaming through the glass caught his face, softening the lines of his expression. Andrea couldn't help but wonder why he was here. It wasn't every day that the vice president walked into a neighborhood cafe. This wasn't Washington, D.C., or a high-profile event. It was a modest place tucked away from the city's hustle and bustle. She tried to dismiss her curiosity, reminding herself that it wasn't her job to question her customers' motives. Still, the moment felt surreal. The cappuccino machine hissed again, snapping Andrea out of her thoughts. She poured the frothy milk over the espresso with care, creating a simple but elegant swirl on top. Placing the cappuccino and croissant onto a tray, she steadied her nerves and made her way back to the table. "Here you go," she said, setting the items down in front of him. JD looked up and smiled faintly. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Andrea replied, Let me know if you need anything else." She turned to leave but hesitated for a moment. She could feel his eyes on her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a quiet curiosity. It was almost as though he was trying to read her, to understand her beyond the surface of their brief exchange. Andrea quickly moved back to the counter, shaking off the inexplicable feeling. Minutes passed, the cafe settling back into its usual rhythm. Andrea busied herself wiping tables and restocking sugar containers, her mind replaying the interaction with JD over and over. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed him occasionally sipping his cappuccino, breaking off small pieces of the croissant. He seemed at ease, unbothered by the quiet murmurs of other patrons or the clinking of dishes behind the counter. Andrea's curiosity only deepened. What was a man like J.D. Vance doing here, alone, in a modest cafe? Was he meeting someone? Was this a deliberate stop or just a spontaneous decision? No. Her manager approached her at the counter, breaking her train of thought. "You doing okay?" Andrea nodded quickly. "Yeah, I'm fine." Her manager gave her a knowing look. "It's not every day the vice president walks into your workplace. Just breathe, okay?" Andrea let out a small, nervous laugh. "I'm trying." Her manager smiled and gave her a pat on the shoulder before heading back toward the kitchen. JD remained at the table for some time, occasionally glancing at the small notepad he had pulled from his pocket. Andrea noticed the slight crease in his brow as he jotted something down. It wasn't hurried or frantic, just deliberate. As he placed the pen back into his pocket, JD folded the paper neatly and slid it under his coffee cup. Andrea caught herself staring again and quickly turned her attention to wiping down the counter. Whatever he was writing, it wasn't her business. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something important was happening, something she wasn't yet meant to understand. The quiet tension in the room felt almost tangible, like the faint hum of a wire stretched tight. JD stood abruptly, pulling on his coat and gathering his phone. "Thank you," he said softly as he passed by Andrea on his way to the door. His words lingered in the air long after the bell above the door jingled again, marking his exit. Andrea exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up her tray. As she walked toward his table to clear it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the moment they had shared, however brief, was about to change everything. Andrea approached JD's table cautiously, her tray balanced in one hand. She wasn't sure why her heart was racing. He was just another customer, right? But something about the quiet interaction lingered in her mind. He wasn't loud, demanding, or dismissive like some patrons she'd encountered. He'd said thank you, smiled, and left her feeling like she mattered, even if only for a moment. The cappuccino cup sat empty, a small residue of foam clinging to the rim. The plate beside it held nothing but a scattering of croissant crumbs. As Andrea reached for them, her eyes caught the folded receipt tucked neatly beneath the coffee cup. Curiosity tugged at her, but she hesitated. Rich customers leaving generous tips wasn't unheard of, though it was rare. Most often, the wealthy treated tipping as an afterthought, a small token meant to expedite service or alleviate guilt. But JD hadn't given her that impression. Her fingers trembled slightly as she picked up the receipt. The weight of the folded paper felt heavier than it should, as if it carried more than just numbers. Unfolding it slowly, Andrea's breath caught in her throat. At the bottom of the receipt, beneath the total, was a number, a tip so large it didn't seem real. 4 crisp digits stared back at her, making her stomach flip. For a moment, her brain struggled to process the figure. But it wasn't just the money. Above the tip was a short, handwritten note in neat, deliberate letters. "Your hard work and kindness don't go unnoticed. I've been where you are, and I promise brighter days are ahead." Andrea's knees buckled and she stumbled into the chair JD had just vacated. Her hands trembled as she read the words again, slower this time, letting each one sink in. Her vision blurred as hot tears filled her eyes. She wasn't crying because of the money, though it would make a difference, of course. It was the note, the weight of its meaning, the acknowledgement of her struggle. J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, had noticed her, not just as a waitress, but as a person. Andrea wiped at her cheeks, her mind swirling with emotions she couldn't name. For weeks, maybe months, she had felt invisible. Her shifts were long and thankless. Her bills piled up faster than she could handle. Yet in a single moment, someone had seen her, truly seen her, and reminded her that her efforts weren't in vain. "Andrea?" The voice startled her. She turned to see her manager standing a few feet away, a mix of concern and curiosity on her face. "You okay?" the older woman asked, her brow furrowed. Andrea swallowed hard, her voice cracking as she replied, "I'm fine. Just a really generous tip." Her manager raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "Generous enough to make you cry?" Wordlessly, Andrea handed her the receipt. Her manager's eyes widened as she scanned the tip and the note. "No way," she breathed, letting out a low whistle. "Who left this?" Andrea nodded toward the corner table. "It was him! J.D. Vance!" Her manager blinked in disbelief. "The vice president? Are you serious?" "Yeah," Andrea said, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled the note back and folded it carefully, as if it were a treasure. "But it's not just the money, it's what he wrote." Her manager softened, her usual stern expression giving way to genuine warmth. Wow, that's something else." Andrea nodded, her throat tightening again. "I didn't do anything special. I just did my job." "Sometimes," her manager said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, "people just know. They can see what you're going through, even if you think you're hiding it. You're here every day, working your tail off, always kind to customers, even the ones who don't deserve it. Maybe he saw that." The words hit Andrea harder than she expected. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them. For months she had been treading water, barely keeping herself and her mother afloat. Kindness had been the one part of herself she hadn't let the world take away, even when it felt like there was nothing left to give. Now someone, of all people the vice president, had noticed. As Andrea tried to collect herself, she became aware of a subtle shift in the cafe's atmosphere. A few co-workers had gathered by the pastry display, whispering and glancing toward JD's former table. News, it seemed, traveled fast. "Andrea," one of the baristas called out, her voice a mix of excitement and disbelief. "You served him, didn't you?" Andrea managed a small smile. "Yeah." "What was he like? Was he nice?" "He was—" Andrea paused, searching for the right words. "He was kind." The barista let out a small laugh. "I'd freak out. That's so crazy." Andrea didn't offer any more details. Somehow, sharing the note or the tip felt too personal, like she'd be giving away a piece of herself. For now, it was hers alone. A quiet moment that she wasn't ready to let the world take from her. The rest of Andrea's shift passed in a blur. She cleared tables, refilled coffee cups, and smiled at customers. But her mind kept drifting back to the folded receipt in her apron pocket. When her shift finally ended, Andrea untied her apron and hung it on its usual hook. As she made her way toward the subway station, she found herself pulling the receipt out again. She stared at the words JD had written, whispering them softly to herself. Brighter days are ahead. She clutched the note tightly, the weight in her chest lifting just a little. For the first time in months, Andrea allowed herself to believe that it might be true. But what Andrea didn't realize was that her quiet moment was about to ripple far beyond the walls of the cafe. The next morning, Andrea awoke to the persistent buzz of her phone on the nightstand. She groaned, rolling over to silence it, but the flood of notifications on the screen caught her attention. "Why is everyone texting me?" she thought, squinting at the messages. One caught her eye. "Andrea, is this you? You're famous." Her heart skipped a beat. Famous? What could that possibly mean? She scrolled through the messages, her fingers trembling slightly. A co-worker had sent her a link to an article with a headline that made her breath hitch. Vice President J.D. Vance leaves. Waitress, a heartfelt note and a generous tip. Andrea bolted upright in bed, her pulse pounding in her ears. Clicking the link, she found herself staring at a photo of her note. The one J.D. had written, the one she'd tucked safely into her apron pocket. The words written in his neat, deliberate handwriting were splashed across the screen for the entire world to see. Her stomach dropped. The article recounted the story in vivid detail. A struggling waitress, a quiet visit from the vice president, a note of encouragement, and a tip so large it bordered on life-changing. Andrea skimmed the text, her mind spinning. There was no mention of her name, but the details, the cafe, the shift, The note were unmistakable. She flipped to another message from a coworker. Someone must have taken a photo of the receipt. It's everywhere now. Check Twitter. Andrea hesitated, her thumb hovering over the app. She wasn't sure she wanted to see what everywhere meant. But curiosity won out, and within seconds, she was scrolling through an endless stream of tweets and comments. This is what the world needs more of: kindness and empathy. J.D. Vance proves he hasn't forgotten his roots. What a gesture. I hope that waitress is okay. She didn't ask for this kind of attention. The reactions ranged from heartfelt to speculative, but they all shared one common theme. Her story wasn't hers anymore. It had become a symbol, a headline, a talking point for strangers who didn't know the first thing about her life. Andrea tossed her phone onto the bed, burying her face in her hands. The note had been so personal, so intimate. Now it was public, dissected by people who didn't understand what it had meant to her. A soft cough from the other room reminded her she wasn't alone. Her mother, frail but determined, had been up early. Andrea could hear the faint hum of the television through the thin apartment walls. Dragging herself out of bed, she walked into the living room, where her mom sat in her recliner, flipping through the channels. The moment Andrea entered, her mother froze, her hand hovering over the remote. On the screen was a headline that made Andrea's knees wobble. A quiet act of kindness from Vice President J.D. Vance goes viral. Her mother looked up, her eyes wide. "Is that you?" Andrea nodded slowly, collapsing onto the couch. Her mom reached out, squeezing her hand. "Andrea, that's a good thing, you know. People need stories like this." "I didn't ask for it," Andrea muttered, folding her arms. "It was just a moment, something private. And now it's everywhere." Her mother's gaze softened. "Sometimes the good things find you, even when you're not looking for them. What he wrote, that was special. People are talking about it because they need to believe there's still kindness in the world. You're part of that now." Andrea swallowed hard, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "It feels too big for me, Mom. Like I don't deserve it." Her mom shook her head firmly. "Don't say that. You work hard every single day to keep us afloat. You're kind to people even when you're tired and hurting. That's who you are, Andrea. And someone saw that. Someone reminded you that you matter." The words settled over Andrea like a warm blanket, but the pit in her stomach remained. When Andrea arrived at the cafe later that morning, it felt like stepping into another world. The usual hum of the quiet cafe had been replaced by a strange energy, a buzz that made her skin prickle. Her co-workers greeted her with wide smiles, their eyes flicking toward the door where reporters had gathered outside. Andrea froze, her stomach twisting. Cameras, microphones, the works. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath. "No." Her manager intercepted her before she reached the counter, a sheepish grin on her face. "Well, you're the talk of the town," she said lightly. "A local celebrity." Andrea groaned. "I don't feel like one." Her manager's expression softened. "What happened yesterday was special, Andrea. Not everyone gets to be part of something like that." Andrea nodded absently, but her focus was on the reporters outside. One of them caught her eye through the window and waved politely. Andrea ducked behind the counter, her pulse quickening. Her coworkers peppered her with questions throughout the morning. What was JD like? What did he say? How did it feel to be part of something so big? Andrea forced polite smiles and vague answers, but inside she felt like a spectator to her own life. The moment with JD had felt so personal, so intimate. Now it belonged to the world. By lunchtime, the media frenzy reached its peak. Customers whispered about her as they placed their orders, a few even trying to sneak photos. Andrea could barely focus on her work, her nerves fraying with each passing minute. The final straw came when her manager approached her with a message. A morning show wanted to interview her. "They're calling it the kindness story of the year," her manager said with a grin. Andrea's stomach churned. The thought of sitting in front of cameras, sharing something so deeply personal, made her feel sick. "I don't know if I can do that," she said quietly. Her manager placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to decide now, but think about it. This is bigger than you, Andrea. People need to hear about hope, about kindness." That evening, Andrea walked home through streets that felt different somehow, both familiar and foreign. She clutched her bag tightly, the note from JD still tucked safely inside. When she reached her small apartment, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. Messages and calls poured in, but she ignored them all. Her fingers traced the edges of the folded receipt as her mother's words echoed in her mind. People need stories like this. Taking a deep breath, Andrea made her decision. The next morning, Andrea sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. The email from the morning show producer glowed on the screen. The words, "We'd love to have you share your story," pulling her in two directions. She had spent the entire night weighing her options. A part of her wanted to ignore the media frenzy, to protect the quiet, personal significance of JD's note. But her mother's words lingered in her mind. People need stories like this. With a shaky breath, Andrea hit the reply button and typed, "I'll do it, but I want to focus on the note and what it represents, not the money." Her phone buzzed almost immediately with a reply. "We'd be honored. See you tomorrow morning." The studio was colder than Andrea expected. The bright lights bore down on her as she sat on a plush couch, the cameras aimed squarely in her direction. Her hands rested nervously in her lap, fingers twisting the hem of her blouse. Across from her, the host leaned forward with a warm smile. "Andrea, thank you so much for being here. Your story has touched millions of people. How are you feeling?" Andrea forced a smile, her heart racing. "A little overwhelmed, honestly. It's all been a lot to take in." The host nodded empathetically. "Understandable. Your moment with Vice President JD Vance has sparked a national conversation about kindness and connection. Let's talk about that note. When you first read it, what went through your mind?" Andrea paused, choosing her words carefully. "At first, I couldn't believe it was real. The tip was generous, of course, but it was the note that really got to me. It wasn't just a customer thanking me for my service. It felt like someone was saying, 'I see you. I understand what you're going through.'" The host held up an enlarged copy of the note, the handwritten words displayed on a screen behind them. "Your hard work and kindness don't go unnoticed. I've been where you are, and I promise brighter days are ahead," she read aloud. "What do you think Vice President Vance meant by this?" Andrea glanced at the note on the screen, her chest tightening. "I think he meant that no matter who we are, we all go through tough times. And sometimes when you're at your lowest, a small gesture can remind you to hold on, to believe that things will get better." The studio fell silent for a moment, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The host smiled warmly. "That's a beautiful message, Andrea. Is there anything you'd like to say to Vice President Vance, if he's watching?" Andrea hesitated, her voice wavering slightly as she spoke. "Just thank you. Not for the money, but for seeing me, for reminding me to keep going. You made more of a difference than you know." After the interview aired, Andrea didn't check her phone. She didn't scroll through the comments or headlines, nor did she pay attention to the growing buzz around her story. Instead, she went back to the cafe the next day, apron tied snugly, ready to face the customers with a new sense of purpose. The cafe was busier than ever, but something felt different. Customers smiled at Andrea in a way they hadn't before, not with pity or condescension, but with genuine warmth. A few left kind notes scribbled on napkins, their words of encouragement bringing a smile to her face. One regular, an older man who usually sat quietly in the corner with a newspaper, stopped her as she refilled his coffee. "You're the young woman from the news, aren't you?" he asked. Andrea nodded shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "We don't hear enough about kindness these days. You reminded people that it still matters." Andrea felt her throat tighten as she murmured a soft, "Thank you." Throughout the day, the small acts of kindness multiplied. A customer paid for a stranger's coffee. Another left a note for the baristas, thanking them for their hard work. The atmosphere in the cafe shifted, the weight of everyday struggles lightened by a collective sense of gratitude. That evening, Andrea walked home with a rare lightness in her step. The folded receipt, now slightly worn from being handled so often, rested safely in her wallet. She pulled it out as she sat on her bed, tracing the words JD had written. For so long, she had felt invisible, like her efforts were swallowed by the endless grind of survival. But now she understood the power of being seen, not just by JD, but by the countless strangers who had reached out in the days since. Her mother called from the living room, breaking Andrea's thoughts. "Andrea, come here." When Andrea walked in, she saw her mom pointing at the television. J.D. Vance was giving a press conference, his calm, familiar voice filling the room. "I believe that small acts of kindness can have a ripple effect," he was saying. "The note I left for a waitress was just that, a small gesture, but it reminded me and hopefully others that we're all connected. No matter how different our lives may seem, we can all take a moment to uplift someone else." Andrea's breath caught. Hearing him speak about the moment they had shared felt surreal, but it also filled her with pride. Her mom smiled knowingly. "See? You've done something good, Andrea. You've reminded people what really matters." Andrea returned her smile, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "I guess so." Over the next few weeks, the attention gradually faded. The cafe returned to its usual rhythm, though the atmosphere remained warmer, more thoughtful. Customers continued to leave small notes and gestures of kindness, their actions inspired by the story. Andrea kept JD's note tucked safely in her wallet, a tangible reminder of that life-changing moment. She didn't look at it every day, but when the weight of the world pressed too heavily on her shoulders, she would pull it out, reread the words, and feel the flicker of hope reignite.